As we saw in the previous video, the individual virtue model assumes that individual virtues protect people from acting unethically. People think that either their superior knowledge or their superior moral qualities would have protected them and prevented them from acting unethically. To see how the situationist model changes the way that we should view ethics, we need to take a look at the way that learning takes place in the brain. All learning involves the training of patterns of neurons in the brain. Now, we obviously can't give a completely accurate or detailed account of how the brain learns, but we can give a rough approximation that is at least true for the most part and adequate to our present purposes. As a general rule, all learning works in the following way. Whenever you do something a particular way, your brain will adapt so that it will either tend to do things in a similar way again, or it will be inhibited so that it will be less likely to act in a similar way again. This is at the root of a psychological phenomenon called cognitive perseverance. Cognitive perseverance says that once a belief or attitude has been adopted, it tends to persist, and in fact, it tends to become stronger and stronger over time. This is true even when the belief is not repeated or rehearsed. It's merely a function of how long it has been held. So the longer a belief has been held, the more difficult it is to change it. Also, the more someone verbally expresses or agrees to a belief, the stronger it tends to become. If someone's belief is challenged, and they defend the belief, this generally causes the belief to become more deeply entrenched and more resistant to change. Acting on a belief also very greatly increases the likelihood that it will continue to be held. This is especially true if one acts on the belief in the presence of others. People tend to hold on to beliefs that are shared by people in their social circles. To give up a belief that your social peers continue to hold is very difficult, especially if you feel that there will be a negative consequence for doing so. When most people hear about the case where a prank caller to a fast food restaurant managed to persuade people to strip search an employee, get her to do naked jumping jacks, and finally perform a sex act, they tend to attack the people involved as deficient in either intellectual or moral virtue. What a bunch of idiots, they say, assuming that the people must have been lacking common sense or basic intelligence. Or they say that the girl who was the victim must have been sexually promiscuous. Somewhere, somehow, they assume there must have been a failure on the part of the people involved, since it's just obvious that normal, intelligent, decent people simply could not have been led to go along with the caller. But let's consider how a situationist explanation might go, at least in its rough outlines. First, it's important that the caller initially identified himself as a police officer. People are socially conditioned to try to avoid causing trouble by not cooperating with the police, and pranks are relatively rare, so if someone on the phone identifies himself as a police officer, you'll probably accept the claim and immediately be disposed to cooperate. But remember how cognitive perseverance works. Once the person taking the call accepts the belief that she's talking to a police officer, that belief begins to become entrenched. Next, the caller asks the manager to search the employee. She has now acted on the belief that the caller is a police officer, causing her belief to become more entrenched. Each time he asks her to do something else and she goes along with it, it becomes more and more difficult for her to reject the initial belief that she's accepted and acted on, that he really is a police officer. Even when his instructions start becoming increasingly strange, the manager's attitude is along the lines, well, I've already come this far, I can't back out now. Questions and counter-arguments in favor of discarding the belief may begin to occur to her, but she discounts and discards them to preserve her existing belief and attitude. The more she does this, the easier it becomes for her to disregard additional questions and concerns. the same psychological mechanisms that explain cognitive perseverance also explain how people can become increasingly irrational in defense of their existing beliefs and attitudes. Psychologically, she shifts the burden of responsibility off of herself. This doesn't seem right to me, but the blame will be on him if anyone complains. The fact that she's a store manager also plays a part. For her to back down once she has already used her authority over the victim could be felt as a threat to that authority. She must preserve her authority, she thinks, and that means she has to continue on the path she's already started down. Admitting a mistake now might mean that her authority will be questioned in the future. So you see, it isn't really difficult to explain how an otherwise normal, ethically decent person, a person who's not significantly lacking in either intellectual or moral virtues, could very well be led, little by little, by situational factors, into participating in an unethical act. We all like to think that we would behave differently. We like to think that our intellectual virtues would protect us. We're too smart to fall for such a trick. Or that our moral virtues would protect us. We're too good, too well-bred, too well brought up. We've gone to good schools or had good parents or good friends. We believe our moral virtues would surely prevent us from going along with a significantly unethical action. But the uncomfortable reality is that we are all influenced by situational factors far more than we would care to admit. Situationism therefore creates a significant practical and ethical dilemma. If we know that situational variables can significantly influence behavior, what do we do about it? One way to make use of the information contained in the situationist model is to incorporate it into our own individual virtues. Intellectually, knowing about the range of situationist influences that can influence our actions and choices, we can guard against them. We can ask ourselves whether we are falling prey to the trap of small steps, whether we are continuing to believe or act a particular way only because of the brain's tendency toward perseverance. Another strategy is to try to change the way the situation is set up to reduce its impact. I'll give you just one example of this kind of approach. Public forums are usually set up so that there's a panel of officials at the front of the room and rows of chairs for any of the general public to come to the event. When someone from the audience has a question or a concern, they usually address the panel. The effect of this situation is that it reinforces the view that the public is secondary in power to the panel. Someone from the audience gets up, addresses the panel, and then it is the panel that is expected to respond and to take action. I had a professor who would go to events like this, but when he had a question or comment to make, he would turn the microphone around and stand facing the audience with his back to the panel of officials, who would often become very upset by this. The attitude of everyone in the room was immediately transformed. The people in the audience no longer felt that they were secondary to the political process and that all the action was where the panel was, and that they should only wait patiently for their turn to address the panel, or should wait for the panel to respond. They felt suddenly that this was their business, all from changing the physical situation of the room. So what can you do to identify and change situational influences that might be affecting your choices and your behaviors? How can you prevent yourself from being steered by situational variables into poor decisions? Think about this, and thanks for watching.